Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Global Viewpoints Forum with Legacy International. As you enter, please keep yourselves on mute. We will have time for questions and discussion following our presentation this afternoon. I want to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Jeff Balch. He's going to be talking about his path from student activist to knighthood, about the choices he made along the way to support transformation in Africa, and about the processes he discovered that are effective in creating lasting impact for social change. Dr. Jeff Balch's 30-year career promoting democracy and human rights spans 40 countries. He grew up in California and started working in the anti-apartheid movement in Europe in the 1980s. He coordinated international observer delegations for transitional elections in Namibia and South Africa. And as director of a parliamentary capacity building organization, he managed training programs with the Pan-African Parliament, the South African Development Community Parliamentary Forum, the East African Legislative Assembly, and West African Parliament, and national parliaments across most of Africa. While focusing on regional integration, peace building, gender equality, children's rights, parliamentary oversight, and democratization, he published widely in these areas and was awarded a professorship at the University of Stellenbosch, South Africa. His thematic expertise also includes reproductive health, food security, climate change, budget scrutiny, and aid effectiveness. He was knighted by the Queen of the Netherlands in 2012 as Officer of the Order of the Orange Nassau as the occasion of his 25th year jubilee of working in human rights in Africa. Currently, he is the Executive Director of Justice for Africa and works part-time as a certified health and wellness coach. I also would like to take this time to welcome Jeff and to turn over to Mr. Rash for a few opening remarks before we get started. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Just want to make sure people are hearing me. I'm having a little trouble today. Good morning, good day. I hope everybody is healthy and fine, and perhaps we're seeing the light on the horizon, inshallah. Today, I awoke to birds chirping, forest sounds, and the silence that accompanies a peaceful sunrise. Others perhaps heard early morning traffic sounds of a city still struggling back to normal commerce after more than a year of COVID-imposed silence, interrupted, unfortunately, all too often by ambulance sirens. Yet others in the last week awoke in the depth of the night by other sirens of impending rocket attacks and explosions. The cacophony of destruction born of generations of fear and distrust. In India, as one young friend wrote to me a few days ago, throughout the night he heard the shuffling of feet and cries of sorrow and pain as people dying of COVID wandered the streets seeking medical assistance and food. While in many places here in the United States, people are mingling in restaurants and attending sports events, others are mourning a new epidemic of violence with over 24 deaths by shootings just a matter of a few days. And unfortunately, just before we started, another shooting in California this morning. So as we struggle with the outer conundrums of addressing the pandemic, climate change, rising tribalism, nationalism, senseless violence, and racial gender inequities, we are hearing more and more the term inflection point. Phrases come and go, but what needs to be affirmed and remain constant is the value of life and principles of peace and justice, to affirm the human potential for good. And indeed, we are at an inflection point. What is the commitment to peace and justice, we ask? How do we redefine and renew democracy and peace? How is it awakened and sustained in the hearts and the minds of humanity, infused into societies? An inflection point is that time when significant change has occurred and is occurring. The question is how to make that change positive and inclusive, now a harbinger of dystopian global entropic society. It falls to good leaders who have the personal aspiration and who can inspire others toward a real and sustainable, just and peaceful society and life. It has been our honor and privilege for over 40 years at Legacy International to help define and train such leaders. Our guest today, Dr. Jeff Balch, is such a person who has been doing that over his career, one who not only shares our vision of a better, more inclusive and peaceful world, but also who knows how to listen to the needs of others and help them to fulfill those needs. He recognizes that the challenge in today's ideological-based world, with its apparent roots in greed and power, is how we can generate leaders who can inspire change for the good, not a course of radical transformation that will not only affirm but transform communities and nations into values-based societies that are just and equitable. We agree that it takes leadership that affirms what unites humanity, the core principles that make us humane human beings. Compassion, patience, love of knowledge, trust, and dialogue are good starting points. And one of the keys to accomplishing this noble goal begins with ourselves and extends to others. We must believe in our personal capacity to find practical and appropriate means to address the pressing issues we face. We must strive to be radical optimists, turn away from the doctrinaire mentality, and affirm collaboration, cooperation. As individuals, we must strive to provide value, not just talk about values, inspire people to aspire to higher goals, and provide inspiring education and training to the next generation of leaders. Our success is founded on developing trust and reliability and faith that resonates with core human values. And whether focusing on policymakers, as Jeff often does, or on next generation leaders, which Legacy does, we strive to set a new positive path for humanity. For over 4 decades, Legacy International has strived to create a new tomorrow today by listening to those we serve and providing them with the very best guides, mentors, trainers that model the efficacy of a values-based life and work ethic. Good leaders like our guest today have the desire and capability to develop a new perspective that fits the time and the place and the circumstances. Leaders who are good listeners, leaders who are lifelong learners, leaders who value values and have a personal commitment to be a better person, which will change the world. We are at an inflection point globally, but we also need to recognize our personal inflection points, seize the opportunities to gain knowledge, change current circumstances, and build a new relationship based on inclusion, common need, and common values. Our guest, Jeff Balch, has spent decades listening to others, working in over 40 countries, striving to guide leaders across Africa to do more than create policy, but to listen to one another and their constituents, to promote a process of transformative change, to ask difficult questions and seek more than just answers to immediate issues, but find lasting solutions to endemic problems. He has, as you were told in the introduction, been recognized for his selfless service to humanity. Dr. Balch is a transformative leader who inspires others to see from a different perspective. To create a new tomorrow today and every day, we all have to surround ourselves with people who listen, who are committed to doing no harm, who are forward thinkers and value principles of justice and realize that everyone at their core seeks to be part of a solution. Dr. Balch is such a person with his infectious optimism. He brings enthusiasm and clarity of thought and words to his mission to guide others to realize their capacity to change themselves and thereby change their communities. He addresses immediate issues to create a better world of dialogue, collaboration, and prosperity for all. It's an honor to welcome Dr. Balch, whose quiet, determined guidance has impacted so many lives. Welcome, Jeff, and thank you for joining us in the Global Viewpoints Forum.
Well, thank you very much for these kind words. I hope my presentation lives up to the introduction. It's an amazing honor for me as well to be able to say something about my story and the path I've taken. And it's an unusual topic to talk about promoting democracy because it doesn't happen very much. We often hear about democracy being undermined, but in fact, if we're looking towards world peace, looking towards development and prosperity, development of democracy is one of the key building blocks towards reaching that. And I started off, by way of introduction, I can say I did start off as an activist, a kind of anti-war activist, anti-apartheid. I'd like to say a little bit about why I became involved in what I was doing, what I've done throughout my career, and how I went about making a difference in different parts of the world. The main I guess, conclusion that I'd like to leave you with and maybe start with is that one individual can change the world by making clear choices, by continually investing in yourself and working determinedly on your dream, whatever that is, and replicating a high level of professionalism in what my experience was professionally, progressively expanding operational contexts, both geographically and demographically. And I'd like to kind of start with one of my inspirations on the next slide, from Martin Luther King. He was challenging people to get up and do something and to stake their life on it, stake their future on it. It's amazing to me that 50 plus years later, after this statement, people are still fighting for their basic rights. People of color, women, people who are disadvantaged and marginalized in society. And as I'll come to a little bit later, there's still much to be done. What's happened to me personally is I grew up about a half hour down the road, down the highway from where Robert Kennedy was murdered in 1968. And inspired by him, his messages, and that of Martin Luther King, I went off to work on ending apartheid. In the first instance, it was a career where the goalposts kept shifting. First in ending the last colony of Africa, Namibia, which was also under apartheid regime. Then in South Africa, being there for the freedom elections in '94. Along the way, I nearly got killed several times. And in the process, figured out what it's like to be inspired by people who are able to vote for the first time and who are willing to put their life on the line to build a just and free society for themselves. In my work, I became one of the teammates, you could say, of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was my chairman of my board for some 15 years. I worked closely with Nelson Mandela after his presidency, when he was in the HIV/AIDS campaign for 6664, and ended up in the Netherlands, as was said, being recognized as being an ambassador for human rights with a knighthood. It was a surprise to me, but it was an honor for the type of work I was doing, and how it demonstrated that this was a little bit out of the ordinary, and it was an attempt, I think, to bring things more into the mainstream. I'd like to kind of send a special message to young people, or to young people of any age, who are looking to find something useful to do in their career. There's a few things, you could say, bits of wisdom I picked up along the way. If something is drawing you, if your heart is speaking to you to go in a certain direction, then listen to it. That is what I did, and by doing that, you won't go wrong. You have a difficult path sometimes, and what I learned is to embrace the difficult, the steep and challenging parts of that path, because those are the ones that may not be pleasant at the moment, but afterwards, looking back, they're some of the greatest learning moments. And along the way, in the nuts and bolts of what I've learned to do, is building a path towards moving from policy and improving policies towards putting them into laws, budgets, systems, oversight systems, and ultimately impact for social change. Just to say a little bit more, much has been said in the introduction, but more specifically, I've trained more than 1,000 election observers, and more than 2,000 legislators and local councillors from more than 40 countries in Africa and more than a dozen countries in Europe. For 10 years, I sat on a board that evaluated all of international development cooperation and was part of the negotiation processes that led up to the SDGs and the Paris Climate Accord. What I will return to several times in my remarks is that even though most people don't trust politicians, and many times legislators and parliaments are blamed for everything that's wrong in any given country at any given time. The truth is that well-functioning legislatures are really, and local councils are really a key to stopping corruption, to getting people's voice heard, to building inclusivity and peace, and a more prosperous and fair and equitable world. I'm not able to see anybody, but I'd like a show of hands. How many people actually trust politicians? I'm not seeing very many hands. There's an assumption, research has been done. In most countries, like 9 out of 10 people think that politicians can't be trusted. You wouldn't buy a used car from them. But in my experience, it's 9 out of 10 who are actually quiet, unsung heroes. They're courageous and they're dedicating their lives for the people that they serve. Just to finish on the question of why, I think we could discuss for a long time about what's wrong with the world. There's a lot of things going right with the world, but the world is in trouble if you look around. And people of all ages need to take effective action. If you start on a career path now, make it one with a strong purpose in there. That choosing a purpose is so needed now. This planet is heating up. Profits are being chosen over people. Resources are getting scarcer, whether it's water or minerals or what have you. And we're involved in a lifetime endeavor to make life livable on this, our planet. And I could mention more examples. I mean, we're talking on the theme of peace building and peacekeeping. It starts from small issues to bigger ones. There are even to cyber attacks on elections, conflicts over a lack of water during a drought period. Depending where you are, your priorities change. But the fact is that, and now moving into kind of the what of what I've been doing, we need politicians, we need good parliamentarians doing their job effectively. And politicians come from every walk of life, and they need to come from all different walks of life. I met teachers, business men and women, scientists, activists, lawyers, all kinds of people, not just lawyers make laws, but indeed from all walks of life, you need them. And we have a deficiency of women in legislatures the world over. And we especially need more women. I can come back in an example later about how I spent years trying to recruit more women into parliaments in Africa, how we were successful at that, what worked for that. But women didn't like it because it's unsafe. In many cases, they were threatened. Their families didn't want to. It was uncomfortable. It's hard work with few resources, and women especially didn't feel like getting their hands dirty. We tried to overcome some of these beliefs about politics in order to get a more balanced gender presence there. But wherever you look, also parliaments and legislatures are underfunded. They're understaffed. And I guess I ended up focusing on them so much because I always wanted to fight for the underdog. And they're definitely the underdog when it comes to international development issues. I have a quote here that inspired me from Nelson Mandela on the eve of going to prison for 27 years. He said, "I have cherished the ideal of a free and democratic society with equal opportunities for all. It's an ideal for which I hope to live and see realized, but if needs be, it's an ideal for which I am prepared to die." And I'm asking people out there, what is your ideal that you're willing to work on? What is it that you care enough to devote your life to? Whatever it is, pick something. Go for it with all your heart. You won't go astray. On the contrary, you will thrive. You will have a life full of meaning and satisfaction. And the quote from, I rephrased the quote from Martin Luther King on the previous slide to say, if you found something to die for, then you found something to live for. And finding something to live for in a world that's looking for meaning is a very important point. I realize the clock is ticking, so let me just move on to the main points I'd like to make about what I've been doing and how I did that. First of all, free and fair elections are the basis of democracy. No matter what I say, I don't want to contradict that. The elections, you see on the slide, you see me sitting in a rally. This is standing in a rally that was a packed outside stadium in Namibia prior to their independence elections. You have to, in a way, stick your neck out. And why was I there? Because there was a threat that the white supremacists that were ruling the country were going to attack the crowd at that rally. And I was encouraged to mingle in the crowd so that it would prevent any attacks from happening. So in a way, you put yourself between in harm's way between the aggressor and the people who are all registered to vote but have never voted yet. And there are even though this was in 1989. There are still people trying to steal different elections. And along the way, I learned all the techniques that it's of different ways that it's possible to do so. But then what I want to say is that actually what is really important is what happens after the election. What happens, those who are elected into office, are they still handcuffed or are they able to do their job? Are they able to prevent that people like we've seen in Africa try to make themselves a president for life? And not only in Africa, you see this, for example, in Ukraine with Lukashenko. It's across the world. It's a threat that needs to be addressed. And even in the United States with the last presidential election and the so-called big lie about the Democrats and Biden stealing the election somehow, despite all of the evidence to the contrary, people still believe this happened, and that is an undermining of the democratic process that we might maybe come back to if we have time for questions later. I have a story I could tell about being in South Africa in 1994 for the elections. I had been an early observer there for 5 different monthly sessions during 93 and the beginning of 94. When the elections came around, I was managing some 300 observers, international from Europe and some from Africa. And we, with the victory of the ANC over the National Party and the apartheid regime, we had a big jubilee. I mean, it was a very joyous occasion, jubilation all around, partying. And by the time I was headed back home, I realized that there had been a genocide taking place in Rwanda. And you can't take your eye off the ball. Even in South Africa, where I was training the newly established provincial legislatures and working with the national parliament there, we still had, after the Mandela Mbeki regime, that corruption crept in against all of the values of the ruling party. There was money being stolen, and even to this day, they're still trying to work on how to reignite the fire under that dream of freedom and fairness and equality. Well, the conclusion of what I learned is that you cannot really predict the future out of this, but what you must do is remain vigilant, and by the work that you do and the oversight that you can perform, you can prevent that type of future from coming about. And I think that if you, I'm just looking here, if you maybe go to the next slide, I'd like to say a little bit about what actually happens in the parliamentary process when legislators are elected. They're there to perform an act of good governance. You have a separation of powers where the executive branch implements what's happening, implements budgets, implements laws. But the parliament is there not only to write laws, but to see that they are implemented well. And when things don't take place the way they were intended, to put things back on the rails again, to go back to the drawing board if that's what's necessary. I mean, here I've worked with children's rights through most of my career, and here's an issue around vaccination. Many countries don't have a policy that just does basic vaccination for all children. So we were working to put a law in place. You put a law in place, and that is the start of a process that I see as a cycle. If you go clockwise, the oversight, you start asking questions. Are people now being vaccinated? And if there are problems, what are the problems? You have to investigate. You have to sometimes do research on your own, or to call a hearing, or invite the responsible implementing agency or minister or secretary of what have you to come before Parliament, answer questions, say why are things not going right, present them with your evidence, and force them to defend their policy and to change it if necessary. In order to do so, in the blue circle, the legislators have to work in close cooperation with civil society, with active citizens, active and informed citizens. And you don't only create the law on your own as a parliamentarian. You go into a committee, you can have inputs from different organizations, different experts out there in the field who are non-political, who are non-partisan, and even from businesses who have a role to play in the economy of, in this case, public health. And then, given that information, you look also at the budget. Is it being funded properly? Why are these problems arising? And what needs to be done? Is there more money that is needed in order to get to reach everyone, which was the intention of law? Or is there some leakage along the way? Is there corruption? Is there a lack of training that needs to be especially prioritized with a new budget line? This type of thing. So you then come back into session armed with new information, new evidence, and you say, okay, this law is what we thought was best 2 years ago. Now we've learned, now we're going to make things better. And so you have a continuous cycle of improvement. If you look at the different parliamentary committees, you see that every sector of society, every sector that demands improvement in social change, from international relations, peace and security, down to health, education, infrastructure. Every different sector of the economy and of society has to follow this process in order to get there. And along the way, you realize, and I've got some examples of that I can maybe come back to, that members of parliament are not equipped to do this work. I'm living in the Netherlands now, and last night we had the presentation by a member of parliament speaking on behalf of someone else who had just left with a burnout because they're overworked. They're overworked, underpaid actually, and there are the same number of parliamentarians in this parliament in the Netherlands as there were when the population some years ago was only half what it is now. So the workload has gone up tremendously, and there are not more people to do it. And again, this comes to a balancing act in the budget and how much they're able to set aside for this type of work. If you want to go maybe quickly to the next slide, I'd like to say something about how I've worked at different levels in trying to make sense of sustainable and resilient Africa. You see a lot of borderlines there in white and in the different colors, different regions, and including the diaspora, and that's where I'm now involved with the 6th region of Africa. The diaspora is defined at the bottom there. 170 million people around the world in the diaspora are counted in this, but it could be, well, many more than that, depending upon how you count it. And the fact is that these borders are just imaginary lines that were drawn by the colonial powers for the most part, and they've stayed there. Even the regional colorings are contested and sometimes shifting. What they do present, though, is an opportunity to move from the national level, or actually at the subnational level. If you take the example of South Africa, I was in anti-apartheid days. We were working with the townships, the black townships, where there were no whites allowed to live there. The blacks were only allowed to live in townships, and they had to create their own municipal administration. But you go from the municipal level, from townships to cities, to, in South Africa, the provincial level, and then the national level. And then you realize at the national level, you've got a lot of issues going on, like, for example, cross-border raids of cattle, for example, or cross-border diseases like HIV and AIDS, or now with COVID, you see how it has crossed borders, and different strains have had different infection rates in different parts of the world. You have to work beyond the borders and create a regional policy. That's what we did in South Africa. South Africa joined a regional bloc, the Southern African Development Conference, and when it joined, it then dwarfed all the other countries together economically, but they worked together and they created policies jointly. And then each of these regions, within the region, they have separate issues, separate policies that they work on. And as a continent, Africa has a Pan-African Parliament, which is in session right now. And we, as Justice for Africa, were making inputs into their session yesterday for Africa Day. And this is vitally important, that they are able to debate and come to resolution about issues that affect not only one or another region, but cross regions and continent as a whole. To give one specific example, and then I think I'll move towards conclusion, because I know time is going on, but what I have done in taking this example was working with women parliamentarians I mentioned earlier. The women were in a vast minority. I think at the maximum in the 90s, there was a country with 10%. We started working with creating what was called the Women's Caucus. And that was a group of elected representatives who spanned different party lines. And they made excellent progress in the Women's Caucus on coming to agreement about issues that the larger parties, dominated by men, all led by men, were unable to come to agreement about. These had to do with household food security, with income for the poorest, around issues around education and healthcare, issues that traditionally have been in the responsibility of women in the household in most of the world, most of Africa in any case. And the upbringing of the children suddenly became more of a priority. And it's a very good thing, because Africa is a youthful continent, and attention to the uses of vital importance. So women's caucuses which worked at the national level to break through barriers of male domination suddenly became important at the regional level too. And in the SADC Parliamentary Forum in all these countries in Southern Africa, they had a women's caucus that did the same thing at the regional level. And they started interacting with women's caucuses we were creating in East, West, and Central Africa. And suddenly there became an understanding that things were going to move forward, particularly with representation of women, and with attention to these other issues that they were raising, that they were prioritizing. And in the end, we had in Southern Africa the strongest, the highest percentage representation of women in parliament in the whole world. And that is being maintained also now in East Africa, that other parts of the world, women just do not compare in terms of numbers to what we have seen as a result of that work. So what can we say about this? That certainly the importance of women, but the importance of working together across party lines is working towards sustainability, towards resilience, and towards a better future. Now, there are any number of other issues I could go to now, like, for example, what we did on climate change, a similar story. But I'd like to round off in the interest of time and move towards a conclusion, and maybe to restate a couple of the main points. What the world really needs is good elections that it can trust to prevent actions like took place on the 6th of January, the storming of the Capitol in Washington, D.C. But it also needs, and maybe more so, very effective legislatures, highly skilled legislators, elected representatives who are informed and watchful, and together with an active citizenry are able to keep a track on the executive branch of government. And maybe with this slide in mind, to think about whatever issue that you may be working on, people all over the world are also having the same concern. And you can take this not only from the level of Africa here, but to the level of the UN, to the level of multi-continental agreements that are there, and find ways to put your issue onto the agenda. And if you maybe just turn to the last slide, I can conclude that really now, I would say the choice is up to you. You're listening. The future really depends on what you do next. I want to end with quotes from two political opponents who disagreed with each other on just about everything, but they did agree on one thing. The first was the President of the United States from 81 to 1989, Ronald Reagan. He said that freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. It must be fought for, protected, and then handed on. And the other quote in a similar vein from Representative John Lewis in the US Congress from 1987 up until 2020 said that ours is the struggle of a lifetime, and maybe even many lifetimes. And each one of us in every generation must do our part. So what I'm saying in conclusion is, this is what I have done. What are you going to do? Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, so much for your presentation. We do have time for questions. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question of Jeff, or you can type in the chat and we'll be monitoring the chat for questions as well. So please go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. This was really informative, and I'm in awe of everything that you've done to support freedoms and and justice. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit to like election rules and how that might impact, you know, the likelihood of, you know, getting good electors or good people in legislature. Like, for example, do you find that there's certain rules like quotas or you know, a proportional system that may work better than others? Are there certain,
Ook
certain
bezig,
rules?
maar ja, maar het is gewoon een discussie.
Well, there's a lot that can be said. There's a lot that's been studied about which electoral system works best. For example, I've worked in countries where there was a quota system installed for women. It had to be in Namibia, for example, it was snuck into the electoral law that at the municipal level, 50% needed to be women. And many laws are very lengthy, and at the last minute, they're not read in detail. And this was passed through without being significantly seen. So sometimes when you're in place, you can play different tricks in order to increase diversity and representation. I think what you've seen in some states in the United States has been trying to change laws to have tricks in place to prevent diversity and some people from voting. And in fact, if you talk about how to tamper with elections, it starts with your electoral law. Who do you allow as candidates or not? And who do you allow to vote? What age do you start? What special requirements might you have? But it works all the way through to where do you have your election booths placed? Are they convenient or not? And I've seen now we've had recently elections in a couple countries in West Africa where there was a constitutional prohibition on third term for president. And the president just went ahead anyway. And they were able to do so during a inter presidential election where they were having elections for the parliament, and the opposition was boycotting. So when the opposition boycotts, they take big risks. And at the last minute, the president threw in a new constitution. Revised constitution meant that he could start the clock ticking again and say, no, this isn't my third term, this is my first term under the new constitution, and I still have 2 to go. So these type of tricks you have to be ever watchful for. And I can give other examples, but I think this, says there's a lot of things that are out there. And it's not only during the voting either, it's afterwards, after the count. There's examples where the count has just been waylaid. And you have when you have exit polls saying that it was about 50-50 and the ruling party announces that they've won with 90% of the vote, something is really wrong. And that happens as well. So the presence of electoral observers all throughout the process from the before the campaign starts, during the campaign, and up to and including the counting of the vote and the announcing of the result are very, very important.
Thank you. Looks like Mr. Rash had his hand raised.
If anybody else wants to go first, let's go ahead. I'm going to throw you a little bit of a curveball if I can.
I was afraid of that.
My friend, no, because I don't know that it is, because can you address the changes that are being called for and a growing movement across the world in questioning the existing capitalistic model and how it plays into this whole corruption, politicization, nationalism? And do you have any thoughts about different aspects of the model? I mean, we at Legacy, we're working with young entrepreneurs. Some of them are here today. Young entrepreneurs and social innovators. We're working with we're working with alternative currency. But I'd like to know your thoughts about the interface between the standard capitalist model and what you see the future could bring.
Well, it's an interesting question because and it's one of the things that I wouldn't say it's a curveball. I would say it's a fastball because it comes right down the middle of the plate sometimes when I get emotional about elections being influenced from outside. We recently, as Justice for Africa, had a series of dialogue events that was in particular had to do with what are we talking about here? Where is the culprit? And we're trying to come to grips with the fact that these elections were being influenced from outside and from inside, from every, and it was hard to ignore the elephant in the room, which was there is a dictator in place, but the dictator, according to many in the country, from former members of the ruling party and from all the opposition, that dictator is just a puppet, and that the real ruling power in that country is comes from the geopolitical sphere. I'm talking about France and its economic and political influence over the whole West Africa region. And these are things which are not only distorting the process. I mean, when it comes down to voting, some people in different parts of the country may be having a shortage of food. And if you have from a foreign benefactor ability to pass out food and money, people, you're going to win votes that way. And so many promises are made during elections, and a lot of times they're not kept. We all know that. But sometimes when you're dealing with, particularly with a large youthful population that hasn't been tricked that many times before, you're able to influence votes with economic power. And this is what's happening from within countries, from not only from the political forces within a country, but from external economic powers which have a stake in one or the other party winning the election. And you can see it in how they continue to make profits hand over fist, so to speak, from the poorest of the poor, rather than having another candidate come in and change things around.
Thank you.
I have a question. Jeff, when you, yeah, well, it's easier to say it. I think it's a little complicated. When you look in the past at your 30 years, can you pull out a certain element or a series of elements that changed the dynamic in these countries from working in one country to working in multiple countries? Was it the women's committees that propelled that movement? Was it a combination of the women's committees with all of the people that you trained through election monitoring? Or what, can you look back and see how it happened, or was it just timing?
Well, I think you have to, if you want to look at impact, sometimes things are a very small change can have a bigger change later on. I could take the example of Lesotho in Southern Africa. When I started working there in 2003, 2004, they didn't have any operational committees working. And we established a women's caucus because this was something of high priority to the women there, and particularly the Minister of Health, who was a woman. And the Women's Caucus demanded that they establish a HIV and AIDS committee in Parliament that would be across different sectors and dealing with what needed to change in people's education, what needed to be changed at the workplace, any number of things, what needed to be changed in order to care for people, and what needed to happen with the massive growing numbers of orphans. At this time, HIV incidence rate in the Lesotho population was around 23%. And it was a disaster because there was no vaccination. There still is no HIV vaccination. There was no real cure at the time. Antiretrovirals was still a number of years away. So we established a HIV/AIDS committee there in the parliament, and suddenly there were other sectors, other dormant committees that had never met, that started demanding that they also meet. So it began with the women. It cascaded into the field of healthcare, but from health it went to all the different sectors that they demanded that their committee become more effective, and in the cycle that I showed you on that slide, to start doing that type of work, and things immediately began to improve.
Thank you for the example.
Great. It looks like we had a question from Haley in the chat. Haley, do you want to just unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I just had a question earlier in the chat. I'd love to just hear your thoughts on what you would say is some of the most important things to remember when you're talking about current issues. So thinking about things like climate change or human rights, and particularly those that don't share your views. This could be something where you're in an influential capacity and trying to impact their opinion, or maybe it's just a conversation with a loved one that you see differently. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Okay, well, I've had the good fortune to work in a number of sectoral areas. I mean, now as a health and wellness coach, I've come back to the area that has felt closest to my heart. But I began as an anti-war activist. I was committed to anti-racist, to anti-apartheid, and I saw in the creation of Africa's latest country, South Sudan, in 2011, I saw a remarkable example of how people who at first were working together for their independence soon began to fight with each other for the spoils of their victory. And it still amazes me how quickly things can turn around. And it's not necessarily in the human heart, but it's in the reasoning that doesn't match the facts anymore. And I think it comes down, to answer your question, what is important is the facts, is knowledge. And we spent years in South Sudan training. I was also, I mean, an example, I wrote a publication with a colleague called No Time to Waste, which was about waste being dropped in the Nile above capital city Juba, where it would come down into the water that people were taking out of the river to drink. And people's health was a cycle that didn't make sense, but people didn't know they were drinking water that was contaminated by their own sanitation. And we needed to raise this fact. And it's not easy to get people to listen to these things. And we had actually one of the South Sudan turned into a bloody civil war with a more or less peace agreed in 2018, but in 2016, we had one of our trainers killed during a training session that got attacked for no good reason. And it's incredible. So I think, just to answer your question, right now, so many people are living in a different reality from each other. And they don't trust what they see on one news channel or the other. And even if you've not been trained, this is one of the areas that we found happening in parliaments. There would be experts coming in front of the parliament, but they were not being truthful. They were spouting the concerns of one or another lobbyist. And sometimes they were talking about scientific results that were actually paid for by a company. And we have to acknowledge that there is a level of society which is very hard to keep monitored. That is, in some ways, you could say above the law because they're above being monitored, and they are setting their own experts in to influence public opinion in the direction that will gain them the most profits. And for one big challenge for the future is just this: people getting a good critical education, critical in the sense of learning how to ask the right questions. Because if you ask the right question, you're halfway to the answer.
Thank you so much.
If I could just jump in. No, that was a comment. I mean, what you're talking about is so much at the foundation of what we try to do at Legacy, as you know, Jeff, which is a values-based education.
Yeah.
And that, to me, one of the reasons why we have everything from a preschool here all the way through the work that we do with people like you around the world at high levels is this understanding that whether it's this transformation in the capitalist model that I was talking about earlier, or social justice, we have to take your quote that you gave and on vigilance. We have to understand that educating the youngest children and giving them affirmation of values is going to be ultimately what transforms the world. I think everything else is piecemeal, and we have to address those things piecemeal over time. But in the long run, as you said, education is critical, and so we need these new models of education. And to me, this technology that we're using right now, learning management systems that we use in our work, everything that we can possibly do, videos, television programs, get away from some of these crazy reality shows that show people in their worst behavior, their most despicable attitudes. We have to consolidate and create new models on every level of communication that support a values-based education. That, to me, is the long game. And as you said earlier in another quote that you gave, I mean, I marched with Dr. King, as you know, and we thought things were going to change, but you realize that it's not in your lifetime that things have to change. Things just have to change as quickly as you can help them change.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree, and I think Ira would too. You raised your hand, I think. Ira, did you want to ask something?
Yeah, nice to hear you, Jeff. I do have a question which follows up on Haley's question. From your experience in dealing with diverse parties, addressing from climate to democracy or whatever, what have you found is successful in creating shared values or a safe space for them to find some positive areas of agreement to create some solutions? What?
Well, when you ask for the nitty gritty, I think that's gets right to the heart of things. I'm not surprised it would come from you. But one of the things that I learned when I was on the steering committee of the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation is that you have to, in order to reach any kind of acceptable agreement, you have to have a multi-stakeholder approach and multi-stakeholder input. Try and get all the parties around the table that have a stake in the outcome. And if you don't do that, it's like you're going to have a peace conference with everyone there except for the one that's causing the most violence. You can't do that and expect to have a good result. If you're going to talk about the field of education, for example, you want to have all different levels of education. You start, maybe you think high school, secondary school is important. maybe think university level is the highest, but if you don't start at elementary or preschool, you're missing a lot of opportunities. Maybe even before preschool, people are learning things that will affect them for the rest of their life. And the other aspect of this is, apart from multi-stakeholder, is what I'm saying here is multi-dimensional, multi-level. And you have to engage with the right entry points that will allow you to have that type of conversation that's going to make a difference and influence the bigger system as a whole. For example, you talk about, in the parliamentary context, presiding officers. And the top presiding officer is the Speaker of the House, the Speaker of the Parliament, the President of the Senate, or the chairperson of the Parliament, in whatever context is. Starting with the top spot, the Speaker, that is a presiding officer that you need to be in touch with in order to influence the agenda for discussion. And that presiding officer presides over a number of other committee chairs. So the committee chairs are presiding officers in their own field. And within each committee, you have political parties represented that have chief whips, that have their own party leadership structures. And they are presiding officers within their party itself. This is just in the political sphere. If you go to the university, you have your department chairs, you have the chancellor, vice chancellor. Every different level you have to take into consideration and try and have the opportune input for that specific level. And it takes a lot of work. It's not like there's a magic recipe that I could point to, but it takes a lot of work just to discover where are these entry points, who are all the stakeholders that you need around the table if you want to have a truly multi-stakeholder approach. I mean, I learned this many times working in the UN organs. Because the UN is an intergovernmental body that's dealing with the executive branch of government, every country they work in. And every UN agency I worked with, they said, well, we work with the government and we work with civil society. And so we're inclusive. And I said, well, aren't you working with the parliament? They said, well, we never thought of that before. And when they said they're working with the government, they assumed the government would deal with parliament, but parliament in a system just like the judiciary, in a system where you have separation of powers, you have to look at every aspect separately. And are they at the table? If not, many UN resolutions were passed by the executive branch of government. They found their way into parliament and they were turned down because the parliament said we were not part of the negotiation, so we will not even address this issue.
Jeff, I have a question.
Yes, go ahead, Steph. You've been waiting.
Thank you. Thank you, Jesse. It is really nice to be in this forum today, as this topic is kind of dear to my heart, being that is democratic effort trying to educate one another. With regards to your reference in regards to, politicians, whether most people don't believe or trust in politicians. Having to look into this, most countries like Nigeria, where politicians tend to use the best, take advantage of those who cannot really feed themselves. So they kind of use the food and the basic needs of life to kind of lord their vote to the people. Why is it that, why can't that be seen as a reason why people should not trust politicians? Because they promise heaven and earth, especially the vulnerable ones, and then they turn around, they don't do what they have promised. And why is it that the UN doesn't regulate a certain accountability for those politicians to be accountable for their actions, according to what they have used to gain the vote from the people?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's a very tough one. I must admit, I don't have all the answers, but I do, and I don't want to apologize for the mistakes that politicians make, because that's not that's not my role. I think they should be held accountable for every mistake that they make, and they should be held accountable at the next election. They should be turned out if they're making mistakes. But many times things happen even with the best intentions. For example, I know in Nigeria, and there are some differences between North and South. I mean, over here in Europe, we oftentimes only hear about Nigeria when girls are kidnapped from schools and taken across the border in the north. But there's a bigger story to that within the region and within the country. And I mean, why are they separately in schools in the first place that are so unsafe? Well, I mean, there are. I can give you an example. Also in Nigeria, for example, you have governors in the different states who are very powerful, and regardless of what might be decided by law in Abuja, you have the governors wielding a lot of power at the state level in Nigeria, and kind of invisible to the political party structures for those of us on the outside of the country, but very visible and meaningful for those inside the country, are the loyalties to kinship and traditional leadership at different levels within the country. And sometimes you try to put in a policy in place, and the law doesn't take into consideration all the factors that it needs to. An example of this was trying to improve food security in very difficult places in Nigeria by allowing people to pay for seeds by their phone. You have a pay for your seeds, and if you can buy seeds from a local dealer, you're investing in the local economy, and you don't have to go through the bank. You don't have to go somewhere, have a bank account. You can just use your phone. And the software for this was maintained, it was put in place, and it didn't work out in two regards. One, the company that was promoting this idea and got a contract for it didn't hold up to the contract that they signed.
That's right.
And secondly, you think this handy tool is workable, but when you get out into some rural areas where you don't have Wi-Fi, you're not able to make that payment. And so you need to talk about all different types of infrastructure. You need to go back to the drawing board sometimes, as I demonstrated in that circular chart. And things may not have gone right the first time around. That doesn't mean you give up. It means you have to work harder, get your thinking cap on, find ways to be more inclusive. And maybe those people who are excluded, women, for example, who weren't sitting around the table, if they are there next time, then they'll make that critical input and suggestion, which makes all the difference.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Stella. Roger, I know you had some comments in the chat. If you, I think we have time for these last set of comments, and then some closing remarks from Mr. Rash and Dr. Balch. So, Roger, please go ahead.
We need to take our.
So as I mentioned in the chat, I participated in the Global Youth Village in the 1980s, which was foundational and so inspirational and continues to drive me to this day and all that I do. I'm currently working at the Disability Rights Fund and Disability Rights Advocacy Fund, which is working with persons with disabilities in different countries, including a number of you've mentioned, such as Nigeria, to increase inclusivity of persons with disabilities, including in the electoral processes. So my question is, if we look at what you've been talking about, democratization can be seen sort of as a 2 steps forward, 1 step back process. The 1980s, the early 1990s rather, was such a high point. And yet we are in a moment where just yesterday in the New York Times, Paul Krugman predicts democracy is dying in the United States. And we see challenges For instance, in Myanmar, it's so inspiring. People are rising up, and yet the repression is fierce, and governments around are not really doing much. We have, you mentioned Africa Day, and it's the anniversary of the founding of the African Union. There are many positive steps, and yet there are all these setbacks. So my question is, what gives you hope when you see all of these challenges in different countries in the world, the rise of a liberal democracy, to think that progress is possible into the future, and that we can stop the backsliding and move forward?
Well, thanks for this question, because it is something, I wouldn't say it keeps me up late at night, but it is something that is on my mind all the time. What are you able to do that's going to make a sustainable difference, that where you don't have this fallback anymore? And what keeps things in place? Well, the quotes that I gave you from Reagan and from John Lewis, they're saying, look, we have to just keep at this. It's never going to be a finished product. What gives me hope is that I see that things continue to improve. I mean, before COVID, it would have been unthinkable to have a conference like we're having here, a discussion like we're having here in the format that we're having it. Now it's daily. It's happening on a daily basis. I used to try to organize conferences on issues that but now the biggest part of the budget for that conference is taken away, because we don't need travel, we don't need accommodation, we don't need taxis, we don't have crime of the when I was shepherding my election observers into South Africa, a bomb went off at the airport. Another bomb went off at our hotel. I mean, when we're able to do things without having to be in hotels and airports and still have the conversation, I think we're getting somewhere. And I do think that humanity is evolving toward a higher consciousness, higher awareness, but it's not without fits and starts, without fallbacks. And you mentioned disability rights, and that's something that continually, when you talk about inclusivity and multi-stakeholder, it's a stakeholder group that continually falls off the edge of the table, so to speak, because you could only have 20 people, and that was 21. And I remember the first time in Mozambique Parliament that they had a blind member. And it was unheard of. And people were saying, how can you have a blind member of parliament? But this was one of the best, most effective members that they had. This guy it required that he had someone supporting him the whole time, so that he could move around. And whenever he would go to a meeting, he would have this other guy with him. But that became a budget of the parliament that they would have. Even if this guy left parliament, that they would still have a budget available for support for someone that needed it, that had a disability. And then when you start making those kind of reforms that are embedded in the basic ground rules, they stay there, and that keeps the door open for the future. And I think we have to keep putting down those markers that stay in place for the future, and eventually we'll get there.
Great, thanks so much, Jeff. Let's go ahead and get a photo before folks, more folks have to leave. A quick screenshot photo, and then we'll have some closing remarks from Dr. Balch and Mr. Rash. So if you would like to be included in the photo, please go ahead and turn your camera on, and we'll give a countdown. All right.
Turn your cameras on. We don't have enough cameras on. There you are.
Great. All right. Is everyone ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay. Great. Thank you so much. Dr. Balch, do you have any closing remarks you would like to share on today?
Well, no, just to repeat and come back to my last remark, that what we are doing as humanity, moving toward the future, towards a better world, towards a better life for ourselves and our children, is not an easy project. And it can't be done in just one area. it has to be done in all areas of the world. And so maybe coming back to what I was saying about diaspora, I'm someone who grew up in California and ended up living in Amsterdam. I've migrated to another part of the world, and I was welcomed here. And many people who migrate around the world are not welcome. And I think we have to realize that wherever you end up, try and make your mark there. And people should give others the benefit of the doubt that it will enable them to make their mark wherever they end up. And that's the kind of world that I'd like to be part of.
Thank you so much. Mr. Ash?
Thank you, Jeff, very much, Dr. Balch. I'm so happy that we had the opportunity to hear you today, and really good questions, and raised a lot of issues. You mentioned Robert Kennedy in your opening, and it just so happens I chose a quote for him for the ending before this started. So I guess we're somehow serendipitously on the same path here, even with the quote. Before I quote Robert Kennedy, I'd like to just tell people that we are now actively working with Justice for Africa, a wonderful group of people to find ways in which Legacy and Justice for Africa can work together to achieve the goals that were described here today. And any thoughts that you might have and needs that you might have that might awaken us to some ways of working together, don't hesitate to contact us, because we're one big family. Robert Kennedy said, "Few will have the greatness to bend history itself, but each of us can work to change a small portion of events. It is from numberless diverse acts of courage and belief that human history is shaped. Each time a man, I will edit, and woman, stands up for an ideal or acts to improve the lot of others or strikes out against injustice, he or she sends forth a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring those ripples, build a current which can sweep down the mightiest walls of oppression and resistance." So thank you, Robert Kennedy, for that, because it fit perfectly with what Dr. Jeff Balch was speaking about today.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you everyone for attending. I just wanted to let everyone know, you might have noticed we're taking a brief pause in Global Viewpoints Forums sessions over the summer, because we have a lot of really exciting virtual programming opportunities that are happening with the Global Youth Village, Tech Girls. There are some programming continuing with our Professional Fellows Program and the Saudi Young Leaders Exchange Program. And we'll have some opportunities to invite friends of Legacy and guests to attend some of those public sessions that'll be happening throughout the summer as our staff deliver those. But in the fall, be on the lookout for the opening back up of the Global Viewpoints Forums. We've really appreciated the opportunity to continue to develop this virtual forum since the pandemic started last year. As you all may know or remember, the Global Viewpoints Forum is something that Legacy has engaged in a variety of different ways over the years, sometimes in person, series of discussions that happened with high profile leaders and folks around the world in Washington, DC and elsewhere. And we've had the opportunity to bring that to everyone virtually over the pandemic. So we'll look forward to seeing you again when those resume. Thank you so much, and thanks for joining today.
Thank you, Jason.
I just want to add really quickly that there's still, I believe, some spaces open in the Global Youth Village virtual this summer. And if you know anyone who can influence anybody to join us, it's going to be another wonderful summer of, unfortunately not in person, but it will be rewarding like it was last summer. So don't hesitate to please invite people to look at the Global Youth Village for the summer.
Yes, thanks so much.